of the people living there were not Jewish. Just 31 years later, most of them were gone.
A national hope.
Balfour wrote a letter that on November 2nd, 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter that would set off a conflict still being fought more than 100 years later.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object.
When Balfour wrote of his government's intent to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, 90% of the people living there were not Jewish. Just 31 years later, most of them were gone.
לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים.
This is the story of the British promise that led to the destruction of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel. Let's start with the obvious question. Why were the British making promises about other people's countries? Short answer, empire is one hell of a drug. This was World War I, and the British were making lots of promises. In addition to promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, they promised Arab leaders independence if they rose up against Britain's enemy, the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs did. Hollywood even made a movie about it.
Arabia's for the Arabs now. That's what I've told them anyway. That's what they think. That's why they're fighting.
Oh, surely.
A month after Balfour's letter, British troops took Palestine, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. The people who lived there were Arabs, mostly Muslims, but there were Christian and Jewish minorities too. There was also a tiny number of European Jews who in the late 1800s had started building small colonies there. At a time when many Jews were suffering horrific persecution in Europe, they felt Palestine could be an escape. The idea of building up a Jewish presence in Palestine became known as Zionism, but it stayed a fringe movement among European Jews. Many of them felt they shouldn't have to leave their countries to avoid persecution. But Zionism as a political movement took a big step forward with an Austrian man called Theodor Herzl. And this guy is a very important name in this story. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, or in English, the Jewish State. In it, he said the only way for Jews to avoid
In the 60 years since the Second World War, Germany has come to terms with what took place in these camps. But what few people realize is that places like Auschwitz were not Germany's first concentration camps, and the Holocaust was not Germany's first genocide. These are the victims of another genocide. But these people weren't Jews or gypsies, and this genocide didn't take place in Europe. These are the remains of Africans. They were killed at the dawn of the 20th century in concentration camps run by the armies of the Kaiser's Second Reich, 30 years before Hitler even came to power. They lie here, forgotten, in the desert wastelands of what is today the modern African state of Namibia. This is the story of the genocide that modern Germany has not come to terms with. For 100 years, what happened in Germany's long-lost African empire has been hidden. It's the story of a genocide that implicates the highest level of the German government, the army, and even some of Germany's biggest companies. But the ghosts of the Namibian genocide have been reawoken. they've returned to haunt modern liberal post-war Germany. And in doing so, they've forced Germany to wake up to a very uncomfortable fact: that the dark racial theories that helped inspire the Nazis run much deeper into German and European history than most people want to acknowledge.
Soldiers received specific orders which allowed them to kill anyone. It was an overall strategy aimed at ethnically cleansing the countryside to create Lebensraum for German settlers.
The whole process was genocidal. The deliberate extermination of the Herero, the Vernietigingsbevel, the destruction order. Many of members of my own family died.
Today, the grandchildren of those who survived the Namibian genocide have begun to fight for compensation and for Germany to acknowledge the first genocide of the 20th century, the genocide of the Second Reich. The story begins in 1884, as delegates from all the great powers of Europe gathered in the grand imperial capital of the German Reich, Berlin. They met to carve up an entire continent. Germany did well out of the scramble for Africa, taking full control of Togo, Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. But just as Germany was beginning her imperial project, new theories were sweeping across Europe that were to have a powerful influence upon that new empire. Some of the most influential were those of a now-forgotten geographer called Friedrich Ratzel.
Friedrich Ratzel was a late 19th, early 20th century German geographer who taught at the University of Leipzig, and he is most famous today for having created Lebensraum theory, the idea that a people or nation must have space and increasing space as they grow in order to survive and prosper.
In his book Anthropogeography, Ratzel argued that some of the living space, or Lebensraum, that Germany needed could be found in her new African colonies. And the ideas of men like Ratzel found a ready audience at the time, because behind the grandeur of the Second Reich, Germany's cities had a terrible secret. A population boom had left millions trapped in overcrowded slums and filthy tenements. Berlin itself had become a byword for urban poverty. The German poor had become the Volk ohne Raum, the people without space. And the poor were voting with their feet. During the 1870s, 1.25 million Germans had chosen to leave and become Americans. Seen through Ratzel's Lebensraum theory, Germany now faced the choice of declining through lack of space and the loss of her population, or expanding into new lands. If she could settle her new African colonies with German farmers, these lands would become satellite states that would spread the German race across the world. A greater Second Reich would emerge, stronger and healthier. But only one of Germany's African colonies seemed to offer any real potential for the settlement of farmers and their families: Namibia, or as it was called then, German Southwest Africa. Friedrich Ratzel and other supporters of imperialism promoted Southwest Africa as an ideal source of Lebensraum. It was mainly free of tropical disease, and although much of it was desert, there were huge tracts of land suitable for farming cattle. But by 1903, only 4,000 German settlers had favored Southwest Africa over New York. One reason for the slow pace of colonization was that the land was already the living space of the local African peoples. If the Volk-Hohenraum were to find living space in Southwest Africa, like colonists elsewhere, they would have to take that land from the Africans. The best land in the colony belonged to a formidable people called the Herero.
The Herero of central Namibia had been in contact with the outside world since the early 1800s. They had wagons, their ox wagons. They had a whole section of the society which could read and write. They were extremely well armed with the latest in firearms. These people were not people who were out of touch with what was going on in the rest of the world. They were extremely well connected.
Under the governor, Theodor Leutwein, Germany followed a colonial policy of negotiations, treaties, and bargaining with the powerful leaders of the Herero and the colony's other tribes. But for many of the settlers who came to German Southwest Africa, the power and influence of the Africans was completely at odds with the racial theories they had brought with them from Europe, and they resented it.
For the settlers that came here, it would have been an unbearable situation, because the reality of Namibia was that they didn't own the land nor the resources. So you have this very strange, almost paradoxical colonial situation where the colonizer comes in and has to rent land and buy cattle from the people he's supposed to be colonizing.
The issue of who was to own the land created huge tensions between the German settlers and the Africans. But what also began to push the two groups towards conflict was that many settlers were so convinced of their own racial supremacy, they began to believe they could treat the Africans with impunity.
Normal Herero people were being made to work for Germans, and they had virtually no recourse to the law to protect themselves when they were abused. So there are very few cases in which Herero people even tried to seek legal redress when they were not paid, when they were beaten, when they were raped, or when someone in their family was killed.
The reputation of German colonial soldiers when it came to the abuse of African women was so bad that it even became known back in Germany, as seen in this newspaper cartoon strip. And as the news of each murder and rape spread among the Herero, they became convinced that they had no option but to resist. They could see that the German settlers were determined to take their land, and to defend it, they began to consider rebellion.
The German settlers want more and more land. They want land, they want it cheaply, and they want it now. And the German soldiers see themselves as the future settlers. They want to become settlers once they've finished their military service. And you have a situation where the German settlers and the German soldiers find one another in the desire for land. And they are opposed in this by Theodor Leutwein, the governor, and by the Herero.
By Christmas 1903, the capital Windhoek was alive with rumors. In the bars, settlers and their allies in the army openly called for a war against the Herero. Governor Leutwein was now the only force in the colony preventing war. But at the exact moment when his cool head was most needed, a minor revolt in the south meant that he and most of the garrison left. The results were disastrous. Within weeks of the governor's departure, the extremists in the army finally pushed the Herero too far. They rose up, and terrible scores were settled as the relatives of Herero raped or killed by Germans took their revenge. In the first few days, over 100 German soldiers and farmers were killed. But the rebellion provided the perfect pretext for the most radical among the settlers and the army to take over the land. They now set about the grim work of ethnically cleansing the colony of the Herero. But there was a problem. Not all the Herero had rebelled. In fact, the rebellion of January 1904 was relatively localized at first, centering around the northern town of Okahanja. Elsewhere, the Herero were just going about their normal lives. To achieve their aim of taking the land, the settlers and the army had to drag the whole Herero nation into the rebellion and transform it into a race war. The story of what happened in the tiny Herero town of Ochimbingwe shows how, once the war had started, it spread to engulf the whole of the Herero people. Today, Ochimbingwe is a forgotten backwater, but in 1904 it was an important Herero center. The Hereros of Ochimbingwe had close links with the community of German settlers with whom they shared the town. 3 days before the outbreak of fighting in the north, the German settlers here gathered to celebrate a wedding. But that evening, a messenger arrived bringing news that the Herero at Okahanja were on the brink of rebellion. Rather than panic, the missionaries of Ochimbingwe instead met with the Herero chief Zacharias, who declared his peaceful intentions. He even wrote a letter to Governor Leutwein, declaring his loyalty to Germany. But the next evening, a group of German soldiers arrived in the town with food and ammunition. During the following days, the white population from the whole area began to abandon their farms and gather in Ochimbingwe. And with each new arrival came a new story of the death and destruction that was sweeping across the colony. As their fears increased, the white population began to fortify a complex of farm buildings belonging to the Halbich family. The Herero, meanwhile, held their normal Sunday service. As their hymns rang out across the town, the German soldiers, only meters away, paced out the range of their field of fire. Barbed wire was strung around the building, and firing holes made in the walls of the Halbich station. On the 23rd of January, just 9 days after the start of the uprising at Okahanja, the German troops finally opened fire. Despite all their demonstrations of loyalty, the Herero of Ochimbingwe was swept into a war they didn't want, against a German community amongst whom they had lived peacefully for years. What was happening in Ochimbingwe was being repeated across the country. What had started as a rebellion was becoming a war. A month after the start of the conflict, Governor Leutwein finally returned to the capital. To end the fighting, he sent a message to the Herero chief Samuel Maharero to begin negotiations. But once the settlers learnt that Leutwein had started negotiations, this fact was immediately leaked to their supporters in Berlin. Back in Germany, right-wing politicians and the pro-imperialist organizations wanted to use the Herero uprising as a pretext to take over the colony completely.
When the Herero uprising breaks out, news of it reaches Berlin on the 14th of January 1904. There is a huge pressure from the Pan-German League, from various other interest groups, attacking the governor, Leutwein, for his soft policy towards the inhabitants of Southwest Africa. And they are putting pressure as much as they can through articles, pamphlets, this kind of thing, propaganda, on public opinion and indirectly, therefore, on the government to take a tougher line.
To the right-wing press, the Herero were not a people with whom Germany should negotiate, but savages who should be crushed.
The German media constructs this image of a savage enemy, this barbaric enemy that kills anybody and rapes white women and kills children. And there's a whole campaign in Germany, a propaganda campaign, to construct this enemy that doesn't really exist.
A heady mix of nationalism, militarism, and racism swept over the Second Reich. Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered a new army to be sent to crush the rebellious Herero. And to lead this force, he appointed a commander with a fearsome reputation, General Lothar von Trotta. Six months after the start of the rebellion, von Trotta landed in southwest Africa. He immediately met with Governor Leutwein and formally took over command. But at their meeting, Leutwein again appealed for negotiations to be resumed with the Herero. And this would have been the normal strategy in a colonial war. But the hysteria in Berlin meant that this no longer was a colonial war.
Von Trotta is not there to negotiate. For von Trotta, negotiation is a sign of weakness. For von Trotta, negotiation would be a shame to German honor, to German militarism. There is only one solution, the destruction of the Herero. Unfortunately for the Herero, they did not see that the rules of the game, as it were, had changed.
Yet the rebellion that von Trotta had come to crush was essentially over. After the initial outburst of violence, the Herero had changed their tactics. After twice fighting the German garrison to a stalemate, the Herero had started to avoid all contact with the Germans. The entire people had instead moved as far away from the German settlements as they could get. They gathered at the last big waterhole before the Kalahari Desert, the great plateau of Waterberg, Water Mountain. There they waited, hoping for negotiations, but they never came.
I think the Hereros would have considered the war over by spring 1904, because the way wars were usually fought in Namibia was there was battles and then that was it. It was over, you settle it and you negotiate terms, and that's the end of that. The Hereros had proved their point. Don't take all our land, treat us as humans, and we'll let that be that. Because they were at the point where they could have attacked Windhoek and the main stations, but decided not to. They backed off, they proved their point. So I think that from the Herero point of view, they were very clear on what had happened. Now the German side of the issue is completely different.
What the Herero at the Waterberg could not possibly have known was that instead of planning negotiations, the Germans were assembling a colonial army unlike any other. Week after week in the late summer of 1904, hundreds of soldiers were sent from Germany, along with huge supplies of the latest weapons and artillery. One of the soldiers of this new army, the young Lieutenant Ritter von Epp, wrote letters to his family while on his way to Namibia. They reveal the extent to which some in the army had come to see the war as a crusade for Lebensraum.
This world is being redistributed. With time, we will inevitably need more space, and only by the sword will we be able to get it. This is a matter for our generation, and for our existence.
Only when he was convinced that he had acquired overwhelming military might did General von Trotta order his army out of their bases and head for the Waterberg. On the morning of the 11th of August 1904, the German cannons and machine guns began to fire on the Herero. General von Trotta's battle plan was, as he said in his own words, to encircle and annihilate the Herero with a simultaneous blow. But these plans were not what they seemed. Von Trotta had left one side of the encirclement weaker, knowing that when they were defeated, the Herero would have to retreat through this gap in the German line. This would force them to escape eastwards. And to the east lay the desert that the Herero called the Omahake, but we know as the Kalahari. By the end of the battle, this was exactly what was happening. The Germans pursued the defeated Herero. For week after week in the summer of 1904, they were pushed deeper and deeper into the Omahake Desert. Once the Herero had been forced past the last waterholes, the Germans built a 200-mile-long line of guard posts to seal them in the desert. Now trapped, thousands began to die of thirst and starvation. But finally, to seal the fate of the Herero, von Trotta did something unprecedented in colonial history.
The history of European rule in late 19th and early 20th century Africa is unbelievably brutal. But what sets the genocide apart of the Herero in German Southwest Africa is General von Trotta's explicitly articulated Vernichtungsbefehl, the annihilation order, in which he committed to paper his plan to destroy the Herero people.
On the 1st of October, 2 months after the Battle of Waterberg, von Trotta and a group of German soldiers reached the waterhole of Asombo Windimbe. The next morning, von Trotta read out a proclamation to his troops.
I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children.
The important thing about Asombo Windimbe is the putting down into writing an official sanctioning of genocide. Why did this take place? I think that the situation had reached an extent where the German military believed that this was perfectly acceptable. They did not see that this was possibly controversial.
The Herero people must leave the land. If they do not do this, I will force them with the cannon. These are my words to the Herero people, the great general of the mighty Kaiser.
The thousands of starving Herero in the Omahake now seemingly had no hope. But in Berlin, the news of von Trotta's extermination order was a shock. The army and its supporters in the Reichstag had badly misjudged the changeable mood of the German people.
When news of the brutality with which Trotta and his troops are putting down the uprising reaches Germany, there are huge and radical protests, above all in the Reichstag, above all among the Centre Party. On this issue, they are radically opposed to the actual policies being conducted. And there are also newspaper articles. It's a national scandal, if you like.
Despite the scandal, the Kaiser refused to order von Trotta to rescind his extermination order. For 2 further months, the Hereros were hunted down in the Omahake, until finally the government forced the Kaiser's hand. On the morning of the 9th of December, a telegram was sent ordering von Trotta to accept the surrender of the Herero. The German army now began patrols to collect what was left of the Herero people. 13,000 were rounded up. Soldiers took photographs of their work. After 6 months being hunted by the German army, the Herero were terrified and untrusting. To persuade them to surrender, German soldiers and missionaries told the Herero that they'd been pardoned by the Kaiser and would now be allowed to return to their homelands. But this was a lie. What Germany now began was an extension of their policy of extermination, using more efficient 20th century methods. Here, by the old German fort in Windhoek, the capital of modern Namibia, lies the site of Germany's first mass concentration camp. In this tiny space, over 4,000 people were beaten, worked, and starved to death by the army of the Second Reich. What happened here and in other camps across this country is something that few people in Germany and Namibia have been willing to confront. But this is where the Herero collected by the army were sent, and where the first genocide of the 20th century reached its terrible conclusion. In 1904, concentration camps were a military innovation that had only been used twice before. But in Namibia, the concept was applied in a completely new way.
Concentration camps in the British model in South Africa or the original Spanish model in Cuba were essentially designed to separate freedom fighters from the people who supported them. In German Southwest Africa, something very different was going on. There were no more free Herero people. They were all, or almost all, in camps.
In the early months of 1905, the Herero was shuttled around the country in cattle trucks. Thousands of them arrived here in Swakopmund. This town, trapped between the great dunes of the Namib Desert and the icy cold waters of the South Atlantic, was the colony's main port. A concentration camp was built here because Swakopmund was a center of German industry and commerce, a place where the slave labor of the prisoners could be best put to use. No one today knows exactly where Swakopmund's 2 concentration camps were located. Yet what happened in those camps was meticulously recorded, documented, and photographed by the Germans themselves. 3,000 Herero were imprisoned in Swakopmund. The majority were women and children. They were made to unload the ships that landed in port and to work on new building projects. Beatings were common, but the conditions in the camps alone proved fatal for many Herero prisoners.
Many members of my own family died in the concentration camps at Swakopmund, because in Swakopmund the weather is extremely cold, and they were not used to that cold weather. They were given only maybe 1 blanket or so. Many of them died. The food was limited, scarce.
The whole system was run with bureaucratic efficiency.
What happened is when the Herero were captured, they were assigned a number. And this number was noted down in a book. And these numbers could then be shifted around to whoever needed labor. And the German military was paid for this labor.
The Germans had thousands of numbered metal tags made specially and shipped out to the colony.
This one is apparently unique in that the number was scratched and another number was put on, because it seems like sometimes they reuse it. Looking at this pass and thinking that my aunt has to wear this thing like a dog around her neck, even my grandmother for that matter, and every Herero person for that matter, it's, I don't know, I don't think there are words to express the pain. I don't have words. It's painful.
The concentration camps were vast reservoirs of slave labor. As the colony's economy began to boom, the army began to rent Herero slaves to private business at a cost of 10 marks a month. But incredibly, some companies were so big that they were permitted to run their own concentration camps.
In Swakopmund and in other cities as well, you would have the camp of the German military, and then you would have camps which were run by a private enterprise. One of these camps was the Verman Company, which is one of the shipping companies. They had their own camp in which they kept people, in which they would use these people for labor.
This shopping mall stands on what is believed to be the site of a concentration camp once owned and administered by the Verman shipping line. Today, black Namibians walk from the township on the outskirts of Swakopmund to stack shelves on the site of the concentration camp where their grandparents' generation were worked to death. Deaths that were grimly and accurately recorded by the German authorities.
There are at least 14 volumes in the Windhoek archives of death registers, Totenregister, And the death register lists the name of a person, which is usually unknown, the age of a person, the sex of a person, the number of the person, and for whom he or she is working at the time of death. And the cause of death, most of the time, is death through exhaustion. And there are pre-printed death certificates with death through exhaustion, pre-printed on the death certificate. This was what was going on in Namibia, 1904 to 1909.
Although there's no shortage of evidence for what happened in the camps, their memory has been wiped from Swakopmund's history. Opposite the probable site of the Verman Line concentration camp, an antique shop sells memorabilia of the Second Reich to the tourists. Under the counter, they sell memorabilia of the Third Reich. About 2,000 Herero died in Swakopmund between 1904 and 1909. But there is no monument or plaque to mark the site of so much suffering. In fact, many in the town continue to deny the existence of the concentration camps. Each summer, the sun transforms Swakopmund into the jewel in modern Namibia's tourist industry. It's marketed as a little Germany under the African sun. The terrible past of this town is not allowed to intrude. But on the outskirts of Swakopmund, there is a bleak and graphic testimony to what happened here a century ago. Each of these mounds is the shallow grave of a victim of Swakopmund's concentration camps. But this graveyard has been denied and forgotten for 100 years. Today, this cemetery is the playground for tourists who ride dune buggies over the remains of the Herero dead.
We know that there are mass graves along the Swakop River in Swakopmund. We know that there are mass graves in the shunting yards in Windhoek. And we know that in Luderitz, the people were simply thrown into the sea. But there is no monument to the people who died in the wars between 1904 and 1909. There is no monument to the first genocides of the 20th century.
Slave labor from the concentration camps was used to build a new German Southwest Africa. Across the country, the years of the camps adorn the date plates of buildings and private homes. Even the present-day Parliament building was built by enslaved prisoners. But the biggest project carried out by slave laborers was the building of the colony's new railways. And the correspondence between the railway companies and the colonial authorities, together with the huge number of photographs taken of the work, reveal how the forced labor of starving prisoners did not just construct the tracks, but helped to continue the genocide. The best documented of the railway projects was the building of a new line in the south. It was constructed by the Lens Company, who between the beginning of 1906 and June 1907 were issued with 2,014 concentration camp prisoners. After just 6 months' work, the Lens Company reported to the colonial government that 1,359 of the prisoners had died, 67.48%.
Men, women and small children from the year of 6 years, they were used as slave laborers all over the country with a terrible death toll. For instance, on the Lüderitz-Aus railway line, you can see every sleeper, there is one dead body.
The Lüderitz-Aus railway line was built to connect Lüderitz, the colony's second port, to the interior. Thanks to the war, this bleak and windswept harbour was for the first and last time in its history suddenly of strategic importance to the army. And while thousands were dying building the railways, Lüderitz itself was also being rebuilt by slave labor. New houses and roads were completed, and the town's docks were upgraded. And in achieving this transformation, hundreds of prisoners from the town's concentration camp were worked to death. But there were two camps in Lüderitz, and the second was different. It had been built on an island out in the harbor, Shark Island. This camp was away from public view, and access to it strictly forbidden. And what was happening here was not about slave labor, but about extermination.
If I were to have to use the language of the Nazi period, then I would certainly see Shark Island as a death camp. It was an island onto which people were placed, and though some people were taken off the island for labor, the express purpose was to essentially eliminate them from the Namibian landscape. It was essentially a camp in which anybody placed on that island, everybody knew they were going to die.
Most of the victims of Shark Island were not Herero. After witnessing the genocide against the Herero, the southern Nama people had also risen against the Germans. They were too late to help save the Herero, but just in time to become the newest victims of the genocide.
It was specifically said in the German newspapers here that the Namas have no merit in the world anymore. They have no reason for living. They are of no use to the world anymore. So I think that there was a very calculated attempt to eradicate the Nama on Shark Island.
In September 1906, 1,732 Nama were sent to the camp after their surrender to the German army. Within 7 months, 1,032 were dead. Of the survivors, 90% were too ill to work. They huddled together against the icy winds of the South Atlantic. Until very recently, there were thought to be only a handful of surviving photographs of the Shark Island camp. That was until the photograph album of the German Lieutenant von Düring came to light. Towards the end of 1905, von Düring began his journey home after fighting in the war against the Herero. Like many officers, Düring took photographs of his part in the great colonial adventure to impress people back home. Most of his photographs are simple snapshots of his friends in the colony. But the ship that was to carry von Düring back to Germany left from Lüderitz Bay. And when he reached the town, he used his rank to gain access to the death camp on Shark Island, where he continued to take photographs. Shark Island is now the municipal camping site for the town of Lüderitz. Visitors come here to spend the night, almost all of them completely unaware that they're camping in a place that was to provide the blueprint for the death camps of the 20th century.
The death camp at Shark Island very clearly is linked to the Vernichtungslager, or annihilation camp, of the Nazi regime. In both cases, prisoners were collected from faraway locations and then shipped via rail in cattle cars, called transport in both cases, and then moved to a remote location beyond the public gaze where they were systematically destroyed. The vast industrial killings of Auschwitz and the other Nazi death camps lay in the future, but the idea of separating people out and simply killing them as quickly as possible was probably born at Shark Island in German Southwest Africa.
There is another aspect of what happened on Shark Island that is horribly similar to what happened in the death camps of the Third Reich. The guards at Shark Island and other camps became involved in the racial sciences that had originally been used to justify the war. Soldiers began to trade in the skulls of dead Herero and Nama people. selling them to scientists, museums, and universities back in Germany. The practice was so widespread that this postcard was produced showing soldiers packing the skulls. But these horrific pictures are of the severed heads of Nama prisoners, probably from Shark Island. They were preserved, numbered, and labelled as Hottentots, the German name for the Nama. They were then studied by race scientists who had been inspired by the theories of a German geneticist called Eugen Fischer, whose ideas were to influence not just the Second Reich, but also the Third.
Eugen Fischer came in 1904 to Namibia. He was sent by some German universities, and he started to make tests on perished and dead prisoners of war over Herero and Nama. And all in all, he has investigated 778 heads of dead and over Herero people. Eugen Fischer used these to prove that the black race is inferior to the Germanic or Aryan race in Europe.
By measuring skulls, facial features, and eye color, Fischer and his protege sought to prove that the native peoples of Africa were not just inferior, but, as he put it, animals. The racial theories that had been used to justify the genocide were now being advanced by the human remains of its victims. By 1908, the concentration camps were finally shut down. 3/4 of the Herero, 65,000 people, had been killed. Half of all the Nama people had also been exterminated. Across the country, hundreds of villages stood empty, and German Southwest Africa finally belonged to the Germans. The settlers now had all the living space they would ever need. Friedrich Ratzel's dream of Lebensraum in Africa had been made real. The last of the Herero and Nama were literally sold off to German farmers as slaves. Even today, there are those who remember the years of enslavement. Evangeline Kanyoka was born in 1909, when her parents were living as slaves. The Herero and Nama were now of no threat to the settlers, and a new phase began in which the colony was portrayed as a settler paradise. And the genocide that had made all this possible was slowly forgotten. Throughout the country, the sites of concentration camps in the desert and on the coast were also forgotten. The slaughter of Waterberg faded from memory, and the suffering of the slave laborers was brushed under the carpet. A new history of the colony was fabricated, in which the events of 1904-1909 were transformed from a genocide into a glorious imperial war. But the racial theories that had allowed Germany to kill thousands of Herero and Nama lived on. At the end of the First World War, the Second Reich and her empire collapsed. Defeat pushed Germany into chaos. Millions were starving on the streets of her great cities. To save the country from a communist revolution, an extreme right-wing movement emerged from within the ranks of the German army. They were called the Freikorps, or Free Army. Among them were many former colonial troops who had taken part in the genocide in Southwest Africa, the most prominent of whom was General Franz Ritter von Epp. And it was from within Epp's Freikorps regiment in Munich that a new political party was formed.
Franz Ritter von Epp may be considered a kind of godfather in the early Nazi party. Serving as general in charge of Munich, he employed what looks like a who's who list of later Nazi leaders, including Walter Schütze, Rudolf Hess, and others. His right-hand man, the founder of the German stormtroopers, the Brown Shirts, was Ernst Röhm, and through Röhm he was introduced to a little lance corporal named Adolf Hitler, who he employed to finger suspected communists within his organization. And as Hitler said, it was under him that I first learned to speak.
Von Epp did everything he could to assist his protégé, even embezzling 60,000 marks to allow Hitler to buy the Völkischer Beobachter, the Munich newspaper that became the official paper of the Nazi Party. But men like von Epp also introduced Hitler to some of the theories that had helped inspire the genocide in Namibia.
From the time that he is sailing from Germany to Namibia to suppress the Herero Rebellion through his writings during the Nazi period, Franz Ritter von Epp is a forthright advocate of Lebensraum. He sees it as absolutely crucial to the German people and empire that they extend well beyond their own borders.
The Nazis built their electoral program upon the foundations of theories like Lebensraum, and by 1931, those ideas had helped them become a major political force. That year, they filmed their party rally in the town of Nuremberg. At Hitler's feet stands von Epp, the veteran of the Battle of Waterberg, side by side with Hitler's deputy Hermann Göring, who was the son of the very first German governor of Southwest Africa. These men, with their connections to the policies of the Second Reich, were to be at the heart of the Third. Just 2 years later, that Third Reich was born. Once in power, the Nazis began to apply their racial theories. But those theories had been built back in the early days of the party, with the help of books written by a man whose ideas were born in Southwest Africa, Eugen Fischer.
And these books were read by Adolf Hitler. And even on 11 pages of Hitler's book, My Struggle, Mein Kampf, you can find a direct reference to Eugen Fischer's works. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, Eugen Fischer got many German honors.
Under the Nazis, Fischer became one of the most powerful men in the world of German racial science. Much of his work was done through the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in the suburbs of Berlin. Scientists here carried out hundreds of experiments and investigations to find justification for Nazi racial theory. And it was here that Fischer's ideas from Southwest Africa were remolded and advanced for use by the Nazis. One of the race scientists who received funding and support from Fischer and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was a young geneticist called Dr. Josef Mengele. At Auschwitz, experiments, theories, and methods influenced by those Fischer had developed in Southwest Africa were now applied by Mengele to the victims of a new genocide and a new system of concentration camps. As part of his work, Mengele sent body parts of the victims of Auschwitz back to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, just as the skulls of the Herero and Nama had been sent to German universities 30 years earlier. At the end of the war, Ritter von Epp and Hermann Göring were once again side by side, this time as prisoners of war. They and the rest of the surviving Nazi leadership were put on trial. But the trial that took place in this courtroom in Nuremberg made little attempt to explore the links between the crimes of the Second Reich and those of the Nazis. But 14 years ago, the ghosts of the Second Reich began to stir, when the independent nation of Namibia emerged from 80 years of South African control. The descendants of the Herero who had survived the genocide began to revive their history. But what they discovered was that the story of the genocide had been completely wiped from official memory. 3 generations of white Namibians had been born into a nation where only their history was officially accepted. And many struggled to accept what the Herero said about the genocide. This was a country that seemed sure of its past. Even today, there is not a single official monument to those who died in the genocide in Namibia. Under the Germans, memorials and statues to the soldiers who took part in the colonial wars of the Second Reich had become national monuments. A cult of denial had taken hold. Histories had been written that were at odds with the actual documents in the National Archives and the memories of men like General von Trotta. But most controversially, the Germans had built a huge statue to celebrate their victory over the Herero, actually on the site of their biggest concentration camp.
You are reminded when you look at these things as the most ugly representation of our history. It's not our horse. It's not our rider. Every time we look at that horse and the rider, it reminds us of our suffering and extermination by the Germans.
But the issue that the Herero have chosen to fight over is land. Most of the Herero and Nama land confiscated by the Kaiser in 1905 remains in the hands of 4,000 white commercial farmers. For most black Namibians, theirs is a country behind fences, off limits. The Herero who'd survived the war and the concentration camps were resettled in tribal reserves.
The land my family owned belongs now to a German farmer. It's no longer ours. Our people subsequently were pushed into the barren areas of the Kalahari, in the semi-desert area. That's why they farmed, and that's where I grew up. That part is painful. Until it is redressed, it will continue to be painful.
For 4 years, Herero leaders have been embroiled in a legal case against the German government for $2 billion in reparations to buy back their former land. In 2004, they marked the centenary of the war and invited Germany to send a representative. The Herero wanted Germany to admit responsibility and use the word genocide. German Development Minister Heidemarie Wiecksereck-Zuhl came to speak at a Herero gathering on the actual site of the Battle of Waterberg.
Today, I want to acknowledge the violence inflicted by the German colonist powers on your ancestors, particularly the Herero and the Nama. The atrocities, the murders, the crimes committed at that time are today termed genocide. And nowadays, General von Trotta would be prosecuted and convicted, and rightly so. And so, in the words of the Lord's Prayer that we share, I ask you to forgive us our trespasses and our guilt.
Germany's apology to the Herero and Nama people of Namibia is a brave and almost unique step. But it's also highly controversial. They have now used the word genocide to describe the actions of General von Trotta. But Trotta left the country in 1905, and it was his successors who ran the concentration camps for 3 years. Germany does not accept that what happened in those camps was genocide. This apology will not appease the Herero, solve the land issue, or end the reparations case.
Right now, we are not demanding a piece of Germany. We are demanding a piece of Namibia. It is our birthright. It is our right to demand it and to want it. We cannot bygones be bygones while we are living like foreigners in our own country. And while we know that the Germans that caused 2 world wars, they are still having their land intact. Unless these issues are addressed and some form of redress is found, our children will continue to demand it for another 1,000 years.
60 years ago, Germany began a process of acceptance and apology for the Holocaust in the Second World War. But many in Germany also claimed that the terrible crimes committed in those years were purely a product of Nazism, an aberration in German history. As the Herero continue to fight for compensation, they are confronting Germany with a history that is completely at odds with that claim. 30 years before Hitler, in a long-forgotten African empire, Germany killed thousands in the concentration camps of the Kaiser's army. This fact is tearing into the heart of the central myth upon which post-war Germany was built. And the ghosts of the Second Reich, now awoken, will not go away.
What's missing from this picture of Native Americans? The answer? They're black slaves. Trail of Tears is one of the greatest tragedies of Native American history. The forced relocation of several tribes in the east to allocated lands in the west. Indians were not alone in this tragedy. The 5 civilized tribes ventured west with their property, which included the thousands of black slaves they owned. Slaves also endured the terrible hardships of the journey whilst continuing to serve their native masters. Once in Indian territory, the tribes re-established slavery, expanding it ever westward. Would go on to use this slave labor to rebuild their nations. Writer Paul Chat
History unfolds like a gripping tale, weaving together moments of triumph and tragedy. Yet, hidden within its pages are the captivating whispers of the top 20 terrible historical facts, shrouded in shadows and seldom discussed. At school, it's forbidden to talk about these top 20 terrible historical facts, as if erasing these dark episodes from our collective memory. From forgotten massacres to hidden conspiracies, the pages of history concealed horrors that challenge our understanding of humanity. What secrets lie beneath the surface, concealed by the veil of silence? How does the omission of these stories impact our understanding of the world? Join us in this video as we explore the top 20 most horrifying historical facts that have been hidden from classrooms. Number 20. The Dancing Plague. In the quaint
While speaking at a formal gathering somewhere off the grid at a discreet location, just after his return from crossing the waters, Malcolm X revealed some very vital, unconventional details on what Negroes, or rather African Americans, were truly considered to be as a nationality of race prior to being called or labeled a Negro.
Aborigine, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine.
Malcolm X stated that the rock landed on us after he returned across the water on homeland. The tens of millions of black trade story was given to all of us in reverse. Amassed colony slaves. The whole slave trade story was given to all of us in reverse. Europe and Africa as Indian slaves. The whole slave and the Holocaust inflicted within America. 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust being your own homeland. The tens of men without it being your own home. How can you be held in exile in your own homeland without it being your own homeland? The tens of millions of black Americans, or rather Indians, who disappeared in 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Hundreds of thousands were shipped to Europe and Africa as Indian slaves. The whole slave trade story was given to all of us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America. The truth is that black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as African Americans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems failed to mention in history programs. The American Society was an organization formed in 1816 with the purpose of transporting free African Americans, or rather Indian slaves, classified as Negroes back then, from the United States to settle on the west coast of Africa. During the decades, the society operated and transported more than 12,000 people to Africa, and the African nation of Liberia was founded. The term African American to refer to all black people was endorsed only since 1988, but was against the desires of the majority of black people. In fact, the term was endorsed by only 5 people, including Reverend Jesse Jackson and Ramona Etlin, leading the charge as a result of a gathering called the African American Summit, without the input of the majority of black people. Author Avis J. Smith went to the district court in Washington, D.C. to stand against this term, as well as against the notion that a small group of powerful individuals should be able to compel the masses into adopting it. The systematic destruction of the Native Americans, or rather Native Indigenous Aborigine people, and their way of life was not only one of recorded history's greatest tragedies, but as with the slave trade, deeply spiritually wounding to all involved. The utter decimation of their culture is one of the most shameful aspects of history, the extent of the damage still being downplayed and denied entry into textbooks and history lessons to this day. I'm just here to make you think.
So what is ClickUp? ClickUp is an all-in-one productivity software where you can manage everything and anything related to your work. Your documents, your chats, your whiteboards, your projects. The value of this, you don't have to buy 5 softwares to do this. You don't have to be hopping back and forth between multiple tabs, trying to find that email from a year ago. Instead, you can find everything in a matter of seconds, keeping your work and everything related to productivity organized in a single place.
What if I told you?
What if I told you?
What if I told you?
That there are a group of black Indians
that created the largest haven
in
in the U.S. for escaped slaves.
In the 1700s, what if I told you?
What if I told you that there was a group of black Indians that led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history?
What if I told you that there were a group of blacks in the United States
that forced their own emancipation
before the Civil War?
What if I told you?
What if I told you that there were a group of black Indians
that led a mass exodus along the Trail of Tears and then right out of the United States?
What if I told you?
What if I told you?
What if I told you that this is the true story of the Black Seminoles, and you've likely never heard it before?
I never learned about them, and they were never in my history books.
This is a story about betrayal, distrust, backstabbing, and about a people that have been, for some reason, lost to history. This is about the Black Seminoles, the Black Indians,
and their long, remarkable journey to freedom.
Can't do this no more, Abigail. I won't.
What do you mean, Abraham? You're scaring me.
We've been slaves long enough now. I won't spend another day under the whip of these crackers.
Escape? Where can we go? You know they'll kill us. They'll kill us
Florida.
dead.
Florida. I heard them say it's free there. It's a chance, Abigail.
Florida? It's so far, Abraham, and it's dangerous.
I'll kill anybody that gets in our way. Staying here is death. We deserve better. You deserve better. We deserve a life free of these crackers.
Live free or die trying.
Live free, die trying. Them, along with several other enslaved Africans, made their way down to Spanish Florida. They fought slavers, bounty hunters, and many were recaptured and lost their lives along the way. But finally, several made it to freedom, at least for a while, in the swamplands of Spanish Florida.
During the same time period, there were several civilized indigenous populations scattered across these lands.
The term civilized tribes was applied to the major Native American tribes that took the bad medicine of the white man. They were classified as civilized because they had adopted the attributes of European culture, becoming Christians, sending their children off to re-education institutions, market participation, intermarriage with white Americans, and
wait for it,
chattel slavery practices, including the purchase of enslaved Africans. Little did they know that the cotton reservations that they had would become cotton plantations after they were stolen and seized by the same white people they were emulating. Hey guys, sorry for the shaky video in advance, but we are on our way to a town called Mosquis, and this is another town here in Mexico. But this town is the closest town we could get to Nacimientos, which is the town that a tribe, actually, the Seminoles from the USA, kind of came over here to seek refuge during times of slavery. They are warrior people. They are a fierce people. There are some survivors, and it's not a whole lot of them there. So we're hoping that we're able to make some contact.
We've been exploring stories of how Africans made it here. And it's a variety of ways, but this community that we're going to is a completely different story and history of how they made it here.
So we're just praying for some favor as we go so we can show you guys and so we can learn about the real deal here in Mexico and black people and their migration here. So see y'all there.
Yes, my name is Wendy Goodlow.
If you don't know how to make chords, this is it. Congratulations. The chords are already made for you.
And we can drag one of these chord progressions in. That's cold. Yeah, we using this one. All right, let's get to it.
These are chords I never would think to come up with by myself because I don't know enough chords. That's the problem.
So that is where a tool like Unisyn's MIDI pack comes into play.
Especially if you don't know anything about music theory, this is the perfect thing to help you out.
The Unison MIDI chord pack.
Unisyn's MIDI chord pack.
The Unison MIDI chord pack.
MIDI chord pack.
Using a MIDI chord pack can really help you overcome beat block because it just gives you a certain vibe of a melody.
It's very good for a bass starting line. It gives you something to work from.
You throw any chords over any beat and you just create something dope. That's what this is about.
You open the pack, you can see it has almost every, not almost every, it has every scale that there exists in the world.
Okay, so if you're not familiar with how these MIDI packs work, it's pretty easy to use. Just choose the key that you want to be in, and then we can take that and just drag that straight to the piano roll.
It's literally just drag and drop.
This is literally a cheat code. Like, this is amazing.
It's been a game changer for me in terms of
I am a Black Seminole, and more specifically, I'm a descendant of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, which were the group of men that joined the military and, you know, fought for the military in the U.S. from 1870 to 1914. So I grew up in Brackettville around that history.
We had not found out about the Black Underground Railroad that led into Mexico. We had never heard about that before.
Yeah, not many people have.
But whoa, like, what you know about this Underground Railroad? What's going on? Black indigenous people moving to Mexico. What is this?
I know, it's a lot. That's what I always tell people. It's a lot of story. You know, the way that our elders began the story was that in the late 1600s, around 1680s into the early 1690s, there were what would become known as the Gullahs, but they were enslaved Africans living in the Low Country who took it upon themselves to seek their own freedom. So instead of going north, they went south into Florida because Florida at that time was a Spanish territory, so it was not part of the formation of the U.S. at that point. It was owned by the Spanish.
In 1687, 8 men, 2 women, and a nursing child escaped from Carolina to Spanish St. Augustine and requested baptism into the true faith. Florida's governor sheltered the runaways out of Christian obligation and refused to return them when an agent from Carolina came to reclaim them. The Slaves' Telegraph quickly reported this outcome, and soon other runaways began arriving in St. Augustine. Florida officials repeatedly solicited Spain for guidance, and finally, on November 7th, 1693, Charles II issued a royal proclamation
giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and by my liberty, others will do the same.
Fort Jose was established freedom seekers who were making their way down from the Carolinas, escaping slavery. If they made it down to Spanish Florida, they could live free.
And once they got there, they found that there were already people there who were living free. There were formerly enslaved Africans, there were free blacks who were living on the land.
At Nero's Town on the Swanee River. Here on the Apalachicola River, even before the one here at Prospect Bluff, you had a settlement near Ocheesee Bluff. They established a separate one where there were several hundred Maroon fighters. You had many settlements of free blacks all through Florida, particularly, late 1700s, early 1800s.
There were also Native Americans. At the same time that was happening, there was the group of Creeks who lived just north of Florida. And because of moral differences, they splintered into the Upper Creeks and Lower Creeks. And the Upper Creeks decided that they wanted to break away and go down into Florida to get away from the Lower Creeks who were taking on more European ways of life. And one of those was to begin chattel slavery. That's where the idea of the word Seminole comes from, is that some linguists believe that it is a Creek word or a Muskogee word, and it's pronounced Shimonoli or Seminole. They believe it means runaway because these Creeks believed that part of their group was running away. And so it's also interesting that it fits for what would become the Black Seminoles because they were essentially running away as well. They formed their own villages but were interacting with the Seminoles, so they would become known as the Black Seminoles.
The African and indigenous people lived and worked closely together. And in time, they came to view themselves as a part of the same loosely organized tribe, cultivating a mutual respect of each other's cultures. The Africans adopted a lot of the Indian garb, and the Indians adopted African agriculture, music, and folklore. And they lived this way for over 100 years, raising generations of children in freedom. As Florida continued to be a haven for black freedom, this didn't set too well with antebellum Georgia. They shared a border, and contentions were high. At this point, there was a lot of retaliation going on. The U.S. military launched raids, tried to steal slaves, steal cattle, and encroach on this Spanish land.
The United States felt that the existence of this community served as something of a beacon of freedom for slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas, or even the Creek Nation, to slip away from bondage and come down here seeking freedom in Florida.
In the spring of 1818, the U.S. government launched their attack.
As soon as the U.S. military was dispatched at the orders of Andrew $20 Jackson, this marked the beginning of the First Seminole War.
The 1818 battle at Suwannee is again recorded by the U.S. military. The people referred to as black warriors held off the U.S. troops.
The Seminoles, known as the Red Sticks in that area, and the Black Seminoles held their ground and held up their contract with the Spanish to defend the border.
They ultimately fell back, and the village was destroyed. Fell back to was the Manatee River, Tampa Bay, Angola.
At the conclusion of the First Seminole War, the Spanish sold Florida to the Americans for $5 million. This drove the Seminoles and the Black Seminoles deeper into Central Florida, deeper into the Everglades. It was here that the two bands grew closer, and it was also here that birthed two legendary leaders, Osceola for the Seminoles and John Horse, aka Abraham, to lead the Black Seminoles.
So the First Seminole War began between 1816 and 1817 when General Andrew Jackson went in and started a war.
I read somewhere that he was trying to recapture black formerly enslaved. They weren't even formerly enslaved at this period. They were never even
They
slaves,
were generations removed. Yeah, they were generations removed. And Andrew Jackson, he was the only president who ever ran on the idea of committing genocide. So he promised that he would wipe out, you know, all Native Americans and return formerly enslaved Africans to their owners.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon is not with physical products. It's
So many people have been emailing me requesting to put the video back up.
What do you do with all of this written literature and history that says that BOUCK3 II of Mali sent 200 ships to the west? One came back and said they were afraid that the others disappeared. And then to have Balboa find this village that looks just like Mali, where he was, what do you do with this information? You ignore it.
The truth hurts. Nobody wants to hear the truth. But the truth is, we are indigenous to America. Watch this. Nipmuc Indians reclassified as free people of color.
Here you have a bunch of people in the dominant culture, the white culture, let's say, saying, you've all vanished. You're no longer Nipmuc people. And you have Nipmuc people saying, well, I consider myself a Nipmuc person. I have a family heritage, I have a set of beliefs, and I have a community that I live with that, for me, is distinctly Nipmuc. At the same time, you have the white culture saying, you're a person of color, you're no longer a Nipmuc person. And that shows through in these county histories and also in the census records at the time. You find a person described in the 1860 census as an Indian. In the 1870 census, they're described as a person of color or a colored person. Same person, but the census taker, as part of the white dominant society, decides that this person is no longer Nipmuc.
You see that? They went from Indian to a person of color. Genocide.
When my family came up around Homer, Louisiana, they migrated during the time when, things was rough for the Indians, so they came to New Orleans. And they passed off as black because they was dark-skinned. And they never even talked about it. They never mentioned it because, they were scared because they didn't want to get sent to the reservation.
If young Metro don't trust you, I'm gonna shoot you.
In recent years, Indian tribes across the country have reaped windfall profits, usually from gambling operations, and some, like the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, from belated government payouts for lands taken hundreds of years ago. But what makes the Seminoles unique is the fact that this tribe, unlike any other, has existed for nearly 3 centuries as a mixture of Indians and blacks, runaway slaves who joined the Indians as warriors in Florida. Together, they fought government troops in some of the bloodiest wars in U.S. history. In the late 1830s, the Seminoles lost their land and were forced to a new Indian home in what is now Oklahoma. Over the years, some of them intermarried, and that blurred the color lines even further. Now, the government is paying the tribe $56 million for those lost Florida lands, and the money is threatening to divide a nation. Talk to Seminole Chief Jerry Haney. He says the black members are no longer welcome by many in the tribe. After 300 years together, the chief says the tribe wants them to either prove they're Indian or get out. What are you hoping that the black Seminoles will do now? Are you hoping they will just pack up and go away?
I would hope so.
So if they're black and they can't prove that they have Indian blood, go away.
Basically, that's what we're saying.
Harsh words from the Seminole chief for the 2,000 black members of this mixed Indian tribe. In response, they say they're just as much Seminole as he is.
I fished in these woods, I hunted in these woods, I went to stomp dances just like the regular Seminoles did. And I never knew I was any different for a long time.
On any given Sunday, go with Loretta Guest to the Indian Baptist Church in Seminole County, Oklahoma, and you'll find red and black Seminoles praying together, singing hymns in Seminole, sharing meals and catching up on tribal news.
Hi, dog.
Walk with her through the Indian cemetery out back, and you'll find their ancestors are buried together as well.
My aunt is next to him.
Were there any distinctions made as to, you all are the black Seminoles, we're nice to you, but you're the black Seminoles?
No, no, nothing like that. We've always been treated as one to another. No difference at all.
It was an alliance that began more than 300 years ago in Florida when runaway slaves and different Indian tribes sought refuge together and later fought the white man. Joe Opala, a history professor at James Madison University in Virginia, says that from the beginning it was a melting pot tribe. So these people all banded together and somehow became Seminole?
Became Seminole, and in fact the word Seminole is not even an Indian word. It is derived from a Spanish word, cimarron, meaning runaway slave. And so from the beginning you don't have an Indian tribe. It was a multi-ethnic coalition.
Historical evidence documents their close relationship. Blacks became chiefs, signed treaties, and served on the tribal council. They intermarried. They were equals, Opala says, and the Indians depended on them as warriors and interpreters. So there absolutely is proof of the black Seminole importance to the tribe.
Absolutely. There's a lot of intelligence information that passes back to Washington. For instance, General Jessup, the commanding general, writes back at one point to the War Department and says, the Negroes rule the Indians. What he was referring to was the fact that no significant decision was ever taken in the Seminole councils unless the black members agreed to it.
When the red and black Seminoles were forced out of Florida in the 1830s, they traveled together hundreds and hundreds of miles by boat and on foot, passing through this barren place on the banks of the Arkansas River all the way to Oklahoma. It was a long and difficult journey referred to as their Trail of Tears for the many who died along the way. Now, nearly 200 years later, comes the $56 million payment from the federal government to compensate the tribe for those lost Florida lands. But the Black Seminoles can't share in it because the government and the tribe say they were slaves of the Red Seminoles back then, and as slaves could not have owned land. Joe Opala, who has worked to preserve their legacy, says that's wrong.
The Black Seminoles fought side by side, died, bled for those lands in Florida. They've been together, they've been good brothers and good neighbors for 3 centuries. It makes no sense now to say they're not Indians.
Our ancestors were some of the most fiercest fighters during the war.
During the Indian Wars?
Yes, due to the fact that they knew if they were recaptured, they were going into slavery, back into slavery.
Bud Crockett and his sister Polly Gentry traced their Seminole roots back to their great-grandmother Dora Davis, who came to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. But family legend and physical resemblance aren't enough. Today, you have to be able to prove your Indian heritage, which is hard for most Black Seminoles because of something called the Dawes Rolls, a government census of sorts created in the late 1800s, which separated the tribe into the Blood or Red Seminoles and the Freedmen or Black Seminoles. Intermarriage made no difference, as Polly and Bud discovered with their ancestors.
If you had any black blood in you whatsoever, you were a freedman.
So it didn't matter how much Indian blood you had. Just
right.
Any black blood,
right.
You went on a separate roll.
Right.
And on the Black Seminole roll, it doesn't list that you have any Indian blood.
That is correct.
Did you feel equal to the Blood Seminoles?
Sure, at one time, yes. Still do. Still do. But when money and the government entered into the picture, everything changed. Everything changed.
If they don't have any Indian blood, then, or prove it, then they're not looked at as Indians.
Putting aside that history of togetherness, the Blood Seminoles are going by the book, that is, the government's book. They're relying on that 100-year-old census which separated the Black Seminoles from the rest of the tribe in determining just who gets the government money today. For Seminole leaders like Chief Jerry Haney, this is what it now comes down to, proof. I've met several Black Seminole women, some of whom look Indian, and yet they can't participate in the benefits. They know they have Indian blood.
I'm well aware of that. The individuals that I know of that say that, you're absolutely right. They show a lot of Indian in them. But it's up to the individual to prove that they are Indians. And this is where the problem is. They can't prove it with the Dawes Commission roll.
What happened to your front porch? You have no steps.
No steps. No steps there, no steps here. And I need a whole house here.
Polly Gentry has lived her entire life on land her grandmother received 100 years ago as a full member of the tribe. All Seminoles, red and black, were given land in Oklahoma. Polly says she could use some of the $56 million judgment fund to repair her house.
My husband decided he's going to put some bricks around it, and he got, far as you see them bricks is now, and he had a heart attack.
And it's been like this?
And it's been like this, because you couldn't get nobody to fix it.
Do you have the money to fix it?
No. No, Lord, no.
So, did you apply for a benefit?
Yeah, but they wouldn't give it to me.
The Seminoles have $56 million coming from the government, and how much of it did you want?
I want enough that I can get me a house built where I can live comfortable, because it ain't no comfortable here.
This whole business of degree of Indian blood is just a concoction. It's just an excuse now that's been dreamed up of late in order to exclude the blacks from membership in the tribe. I can tell you this, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, Seminole Indians would not have been talking about whether or not this black person has Indian blood. It simply wouldn't have mattered. They were Seminoles.
You know what the motion is? We'll go ahead and vote on it. So.
For more than 100 of those years, Black Seminoles held 4 of the 28 seats on the tribal council. But that ended at a meeting like this one in the summer of 2000, when the Red Seminoles voted the blacks out. Sylvia Davis, who was one of the 4 black council members at the time, says it was humiliating.
It's been hard for me to sit there and listen to the way they talk to the freedmen. It's been very hard for me.
What do they say?
The racist names that they be using toward them, calling them animals' names, cows, stomping feet, roaring at them, telling them to get out.
They don't want you.
That's right. They'll tell you to go back to Africa.
Why do you think the freedmen, the black Seminoles, belong as part of this tribe?
Because we had people that die along the trail, just like any other people in the nation.
But I guess they're saying, yes, thank you. You fought alongside us in Florida. That was 200 years ago. It's time for us to separate.
I would just let them know that we have all rights within the Seminole Nation.
But Chief Haney says many of the black Seminoles and even some of the blood Seminoles weren't interested in being part of the tribe until it included benefits, namely a piece of that $56 million government payout.
The tribe wanted to have an Indian tribe that was all Indian tribe.
There are too many freedmen.
I think there's a lot of freedmen out there now that are eligible to join, but have not joined because there are no benefits.
But you think if there were benefits for them, suddenly freedmen would be coming from
Yes.
all across the country?
Yes.
Let me tell you what it looks like from the outside, though. It looks like the freedmen fought wars, died with you, moved on the Trail of Tears from Florida to Oklahoma with you, and now suddenly there's a big pot of money. Let's exclude them.
That may be true to some extent, but I don't think that's all of the reasons for what has happened.
He also says the red and black Seminoles have just grown apart over the years and have little in common today. But that's not how Sylvia Davis sees it. She's hired Will and John Veely, 2 young attorneys who specialize in Indian law. They're suing the government on behalf of the black Seminoles.
The entire tribe received a county in exchange for a state. When that was individually allotted, all Seminoles, including the black Seminoles, received their individual allotments. When the United States awarded $56 million, shouldn't the same people that received the land before also receive the money? The tribe's the same.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs chose not to speak on camera, citing the pending lawsuit. However, in a letter to us, they say that these kinds of issues are up to the tribe. Eligibility for the judgment fund, the letter says, may depend upon whether a current member is descended from a member of the tribe as the tribe existed in 1823. However, the letter says, deciding who's in and who's out is solely within the purview of the tribe. But the black Seminoles say they won't go quietly. They continue trying to cast votes and participate in tribal meetings without success. Bud Crockett says he won't be denied his heritage, but he won't beg for it either.
It's not all about the money. It's about setting the history record straight about our ancestry and our history and what legacy we intend to leave for our kids.
Since the black Seminoles were removed, the government has cut off all federal funding to the tribe. That's persuaded some, like Chief Haney, to say they should be allowed back in, but he still says they're not entitled to that $56 million.
Stop trying to think positively and think it will help you manifest abundance. Because it will hardly change anything until you start turning on your epigenetic with this 3-second atomic switch. The epigenetic discovery was not released to the public because the greedy gurus want to keep this sacred information to themselves, as it will put them out of business. Because this 3-second atomic switch works no matter what age you are. Just use the 3-second atomic switch to make abundance come to you. Click the Learn More button and watch the video right now.
Zapier's easy automation can send every marketing lead directly into your sales team's pipeline. We work with over 5,000 apps, so you can still use the tools that keep your business growing. Automation gives you the flexibility to scale your workflows when your big goals get bigger. So you can watch your lead and revenue charts go up and to the right. Automation isn't magic, it's Zapier. Get started for free.
All right. Halito, everybody. OCO, I hope everybody doing great on this Tuesday, man. Seems like it's been a long week already. We're gonna get into this thing, man. Seems like it's been a long week already. Halito, everybody in the chat. Let me go in the chat. Make sure I let y'all get started, man. Yeah, man. So I've been sitting up, man. I've been doing a little thinking, man. I've been sitting back and I've been paying attention to what's been going on with Donald Trump. I've been paying attention to what's been going on in the news, period. And the subject of the 1866 Indian treaties came up again. They're supposedly, working to try to fix the issues with the 1866 Indian treaties as it pertains to so-called Black Americans. But their speech has not been congruent with their actions. It has not been congruent with their actions because they say one thing and they do something else. So my thing is this: why have we not received any restitution for the 1866 Indian treaties? And that's why I put these treaties on my website, so you guys can read them and understand what is owed to us as a people for these treaties. We are owed far more than reparations. That was the main purpose of why I went to go get the treaties and put the treaties on my website at theresearchguy.com. So you guys can read these treaties, see what's owed to us, and we can go. And I feel, and just me personally, I feel like we as a people should not be looking for reparations, but looking for them to actually uphold these 1866 Indian treaties. That's what we should be focused on. And I'm going to play a video for you guys. Hold on. Let me play this video real quick. And I want you guys to pay attention to what's being said. Watch this. And then you guys let me know what's up. Hold on. Let me try to do this again. I may have to share my screen with y'all real quick. Let's see. Hold on, y'all. Give me 1 second.
To be free and flexible and creative was really essential to what I wanted to make, and I didn't find a platform that did that other than Wix. Hi, I'm Liv. I run Double Bricks, a print and design studio in Brighton, UK.
I chose Wix for my business because of its massive scope for functionality and freedom of creation. Everything I create at Doppel is visual. So for me, those customizable elements like the hovers and the little animations, the additional bits of coding, the physicality of the actual process of printing really reflects me. From a business perspective, it was really exciting. Directing people to that site was going to give them everything that they needed.
Stop making Amazon sellers rich. I hate to tell you this, but every single time you shop on Amazon, you're making someone like me semi-passive income. That's right, someone who, like me, who dropped out of 3 different colleges and now making a full-time living selling products on Amazon. Now, I wanna show you a trick for how you can tell how much money you're making someone like me on Amazon per month. Now, come check this out. Step 1, next time you shop on Amazon, scroll down to the product description part and see what the best seller rank is. Step 2, check if this ranking is below 10,000. If it is, it means that this person is making tens of thousands of dollars per month in semi-passive income. I mean, take the silicone whisk, for example. Guess what? It's not sold by some big company. It's likely sold by someone like me or my friends, where we send our products to Amazon and Amazon does all the heavy lifting for us. So if we scroll down, this has a bestseller rank of 5,247. It's currently generating someone $32,000 a month in passive income. So the question is, why help others make passive income when you can potentially earn yours as well? Hi, my name is Tom Wong. A few years ago, I was working a 9-to-5 job at Yellow Pages, but I knew I always wanted to create a side hustle for myself. So when someone introduced me to the world of Amazon, at first I was super skeptical. I thought Amazon was a place where you just buy old textbooks from. However, I quickly realized that Amazon will find customers for you, they'll fulfill all your orders, they'll handle all the returns, the shipping, they literally do 90% of the work for you. Now, all you need to do is find a profitable product to sell. A few years later, I was able to quit my full-time job and work on my Amazon business full-time. Now I can travel and do the stuff I like. And by the way, this is my sales over the past few years. I've also started teaching this method to others to see if I got lucky or if my system is repeatable. And turns out it is. Check out all these people's results. Even my friend Lance started selling on Amazon, and within 6 months, he was making over $30,000 a month in sales on Amazon. Oh, by the way, before Amazon, he barely had any time for himself or his family. But now he only has to work 1 or 2 hours a day to make a great living. So if you're interested in learning how to create your own brand and sell random products on Amazon, I created a free training where I teach you how to start your own Amazon business step by step. Even if you're working a 9-to-5 job like me, and you don't need to get any experience to get started. So click on this ad right now, and I'll see you in the free training.
Address, if you would, the role that the U.S. government, see, this wasn't willy-nilly cowboys, running wild. This was a U.S. government and its policies that ultimately bastardized, took away from, stole from the Native Americans, made treaties that ultimately were broken. If you want to say willy-nilly, that's where willy-nilly came in. So if you would address that for a moment.
Well, yes, and see, it started at one of the first treaties was the New York Treaty about 1516 that came in. That was one of the first treaties. But in every one of those treaties that they set up with the Indians, they put an inclusion in there saying this, that if you were to cooperate with us and be able to help us maintain the slavery system we set up in this country, and we will reward you and compensate you. We'll give you clothing, we'll give you food, we'll give you weapons, and we'll even call you civilized if you will help us maintain slavery. Every treaty contained a clause to help Indians to shut down black folk. Slavery could never have existed in this country and been maintained without the full participation of the American tribes. That's why they started calling them civilized, Rock, because they began to say, you quit hunting in the woods and running wild and get yourself some land and get yourself some slaves. So Indians became slave hunters, slave traders, and in the final analysis, all civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, they all fought with the South to maintain slavery. And so therefore, and they got benefits from it. And that led to, going back to the earlier question you asked me about reparations. And even after the Civil War ended, the Choctaw and Chickasaw was still holding about 12 or 15,000 slaves even after the Civil War ended. The United States government sent in troops saying, you got to get rid of this slavery and set black folk free. And they set up what's called the 1866 Indian Treaties with these 5 civilized tribes, which says that black people in this country must not only turn them loose, they must get benefits. They must get forms of reparations. Going back to your earlier question, you must first of all set them free. 2, you must give them an option, and this is for all black freedmen and all blacks who lived in the Indian Territory and all black Indians. You must set them free, allow them to have membership in the tribe. You must give them, let them have access to all the resources on the reservation. You must let them also be tax exempt. You must let them have free education. You must also let them be able to give them $150 in cash. You must give them 160 acres of land. And in present day times, those black Indians under the 1866 treaty should be getting, they could also hold gambling casinos. Now, this country has never carried out the full mandates, but yet we're still honoring it for Indians. Right now, all the benefits that Indians are getting in this country are getting it from the 1866 Indian Treaty, because they took up arms against the United States in the Civil War. They wiped out all previous treaties. Now, every year in the White House, we get about 567 white Indian chiefs, which in history they call $5 Indians, because 90% of the people call themselves Indians nowadays are not really Indians. Those are whites passing as Indians, because they paid $5 to the Dawes Commission to get their name on the Dawes roll so they can get all these advantages. But every year they get invited to the White House. And every year they got an approximately $3.5 billion every year, even that Obama's been in office. They got money into the Federal Indian Bureau. Now, see, if you were to talk about reparations, black folks have been getting all this money all these years too. But they got shut out because the Indians in 1938, they sent a letter to the Department of Bureau of Indian Affairs saying, how do we shut black folk down to make sure they never get any reparations? And that letter floated around in the federal government from about 1938 to about 1941. Then it went to the Secretary for the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior looked and says, said, how do I come up with a scheme to shut down blacks so they get no reparations in this country? He said, what you do, you Indians come up with a new concept called a quantum blood law, which says that black folk are not entitled to any of the benefits of the 1866 treaty in terms of reparations unless they can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they got 1/4 Indian blood in them. And we make Indian blood sacred like Jesus Christ's blood. And therefore, they've been shutting blacks out all these years. That's why they didn't get any reparations, to go back to your earlier point. And the last point on reparations, you asked me earlier about a blueprint. This country's always given reparations to all groups except black folk, even though black folk were the ones who built the country. They built the bridges, they picked the cotton, they built the highways, they built the government buildings. They were the backbone of this nation. But now, so in the Marshall Plan, we gave billions of dollars to Germans after World War II. We gave under what's called a Point 4 program. We gave reparations to Japanese. We gave reparations to American Indians. We gave reparations to everybody but black folk. Yet black folk are locked into the bottom of a vertical order and a descending order of wealth, owning, and poverty, and control of resources, and nobody wants to address the issue.
Whatever you love to do in life, take the Blazer from your Metro Detroit Chevy dealers along for the ride. From enjoying your favorite hobby to making your house a home, the Chevy Blazer is the perfect SUV for doing whatever makes you smile. Lease a 2024 Blazer 2LT for just $289 a month. Put it in D and see why Chevy drives the Motor City.
So do y'all see this? This is what I'm talking about, man. So in July 19th, 1866, we know the U.S. government, they signed this 1866 Indian Treaty, and a lot of our people, believe it or not, were slave owners. Yeah, I know that's going to be hard to understand and it's going to be hard for people to take in, but a lot of our own people owned slaves. Yes, they did, because my grandfather, I can show you records on my grandfather, he had them. So we need to understand all of that part about these treaties. But the point of what I wanted to bring out was because we never talk about these 1866 treaties and what we are owed in those treaties. So when a lot of these Native Americans, because I had a lot of backlash, I listen, I can go in my email, right? I could just put my email on screen and show you many, many emails from Native Americans, Europeans, saying, oh, you guys just trying to claim that you're Native so you can get some benefits. Well, let's backtrack. Let's not even talk about who is Native or who is indigenous or who is American Indian and all of that. We're not even talking about that portion of it. Let's just talk about it from a business standpoint. Even if you claim, well, you guys are Africans and blah, 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 and it doesn't matter. If you were born in that territory during that time of July 19th, anytime before July 19th, 1866, any of the people who went on a Trail of Tears during the 1830 Indian removal